Laura Glazer works here along with many other places, performance maker, helped make tonight's work, feels slightly resident here because she teaches here. Shane's work here that you've just seen, who feels definitely resident because he's been here so much, organising the weavings that have gone on, both with people and with string. Am I allowed to call it string?
Yeah.
And Trish seems nearly resident because she comes to so many of the talks and always asks fantastic questions and provokes discussion. But now she's on this side of the microphones, and so I'm looking forward very much to what is going to happen. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sue. So
Are you on?
I'm on.
Yeah.
Can everybody hear me? Yes?
If you talk loudly, yes.
If I talk loudly, I'll try my best. Now, as Trish and I and Laura were discussing how to plan this talk, and having identified the subjects we wanted to talk about, which is a lot to do with language and how to communicate instructions between myself, the dancers, Laura, the idea of language, the idea of translation, of communication came up, and of course we've been dealing with and battling with material and making. The piece you've just seen is as much a dance as sort of watching things being done, being made. So without saying too much, I don't want to preempt you what is going to come next, but we thought we'd start with the demonstration, hence you've been given your little piece of string. And what I'd like to do is a demonstration, which won't be a visual one. I don't have a piece of string myself. I'm going to talk you through a way of cording or making cordage, which is an ancient craft, something that would be made using grasses and sort of any flexible fibers that would make string, and from this string, using this string, baskets would be made. The earliest baskets were found 8,000–9,000 years ago, so it is a really ancient way of making, maybe one of the first ways of making. So that's a bit of background to what you're going to be doing. I usually, though I haven't demonstrated how to make cordage, I would usually have the piece myself and show you how it's done. But to give you a context of what it was to work with Laura and prepare this piece and having to find a way of communicating across different languages from sort of art to dance, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just talk you through. I'm going to not even use my hands. I'm going to put them underneath my thighs, so there'll be no visual reference on this side of the room. You'll need to just listen to what I say, and I haven't rehearsed this, so I'll have to think my way through, and then we'll see what happens. Okay? So, holding your piece of string, I'd like you to fold it in half to start with. Okay, now you have a piece of string that's half the length it was originally, and on one end you have the two ends of the piece of string, and on the other end you have what we'll call the bend. Okay? Now the bend I'd like you to hold with your left hand using your thumb and index finger. Okay? And as you do this, indeed a precise science, as you do this, I'd like you to bring both strands as close together as you can. Okay? So this is with your left hand. And with your right hand, I'd like you to, with the thumb and first finger, with the back of your hand facing you, I'd like you to hold the top strand closest to the bend. Okay? So from where I'm looking, nobody's actually doing it here. Okay? So you need to let go of the two ends of the string, move your right hand close to the bend and hold the top. You're holding the string horizontally as well, by the way. And you hold the top strand. Okay, everybody there? So your fingers are touching each other from both hands. Okay? And then what I'd like you to do is to twist. You've got the back of your hand facing you. I'd like you to twist the strand away from you. With the middle finger, hold the bottom strand. So you're holding both strands. And then twist your hand back so that your palm, sorry, not the palm, the back of the hand is facing you. Okay? So you twist away the top strand. Cheryl, you need to, I'm not really picking on you, but you need to have both hands, the fingers of both hands, close to the bend. So you let go of the two ends of the string and you move your hand to the bend. That's right. You hold the top strand and you twist away. Okay? Once you've twisted away, I'm repeating the same instruction. Gosh, this is proving to be much harder than I thought it would be. You're not the only one struggling. So once you've twisted the strand away, you use your middle finger to hold both strands and you twist back. What you're doing is you're inverting the top and bottom strand. Okay? All right, now once you've got that twist, you move the thumb and first finger of your left hand onto that twist to secure it. Okay? And then you grab the top strand again. You're nowhere near doing it either. It's all right. Just watch Finn. He'll be... And so repeat that process. So you've moved your thumb and first finger on the last twist, and then with your left hand, with your right hand, I'm sorry, I've got really confused now. Which hand held the bend initially? Left. The left. Okay, so with the right hand, you're twisting the top strand away from you, middle finger holding both strands, and you twist back, and you're going to get another twist. Okay? All right. Okay, very good.
Somebody's showing off.
I haven't got my glasses, so I can't really see over there, but yes, nice. Okay, so the chording, you should see the chording being made, or the string being made, because with the twist and counter-twist action, the string somehow magically holds itself together. The two strands that are twisted hold together.
Do you want
No. Okay. Good. All right. Well done, everyone. So I think that worked really well. It's given you some kind of insight into the difficulties and the challenges and the rewards we've had actually trying to establish some understanding of how to move while making. Okay? And Trish said a lovely thing just before we came, is that, you know, to sort of finish this making session is, she talked about knots and the importance of knotting them, and knotting them as a way to remember. So you've got your knot, you've got your twist. I'm not quite sure what you have in your hand, but do put it in your pocket and sort of keep that thought. All right.
So we don't forget.
So we don't forget.
So we don't forget.
So we don't forget, indeed.
And because memory is going to be something that we bring up in this discussion, we hope. But I'd really like to begin by asking Laura and Shane to talk a little bit about their backgrounds, so you see, at least get an idea of where they came from in order to get to this point where they intersected. So I'll pass it over to Laura just to sort of introduce what you do and your background and what you do now.
I trained as a contemporary dancer, and I've been teaching for quite a few years contemporary dance and something called experiential anatomy, which is the anatomy experienced rather than the theoretical part. And I've been teaching here evening classes for quite a few years, contemporary dance technique, but also a creative class. And actually this project was part of the creative class. So participants of the creative dance class were in this project. And I also perform here and then. The latest performance was at the Barbican, Trisha Brown's works. I was walking on the wall and things like that. Also gallery work. So I mainly work with movement and not so much with threads and cords and stitching.
Shane?
Yes. Well, my background is in fine art. I studied sculpture a few years back, and while studying, got very interested in notions of monumentality, and sort of got interested in installation work and works that, looking beyond the object into things, making things that interacted with architecture. I worked in studios, or rather a college here in Camberwell, and I also went to Belgium, where doing a short transfer, I ended up in monumental arts, a monumental arts studio, where I had a realization that working with the more traditional materials, such as wood, metal, and stone, was really not for me, and I went to the recently open fashion department at that college and became an expert at working with overlocking machines and working with fabric, and started stitching. And for many reasons, which maybe I'll talk about later, I sort of steered away from what my peers were doing and got interested in sort of textiles and craft practice, which has led me to focus more recently or look at weaving in its broadest form, from basketry to textile weaving.
Great. So this gives you a pretty clear idea, I think, about Laura as a dancer, trained as a dancer, teaches as a dancer. Shane's an artist, trained as an artist, teaches as an artist. So bring these two together, and it would be fairly straightforward, one would think, about how to make something happen. So I arrived on the scene at a rehearsal with the dancers and Shane and Laura, who I hadn't met before, giving the dancers instructions, and it was chaos. Bobbins were swinging in the stairwell, things were sort of said, well, all I want you to do is pass the thread. I want you to face each other and pass the thread to your left hands. So they would face each other and cross and not understand what the instructions were. It's quite surprising to see the piece of work that we saw tonight, which was very serene, controlled, and hardly chaotic. In fact, highly controlled and very patterned and slow and unraveling in order to create this pattern. And what I found when they were doing the instructions, and dancers have very good body memory and can remember things when they see them. Artists have very good visual memory and can repeat things visually very quickly, master copiers of anything that they can see, outline, trace, reproduce. And somehow, even with these mechanisms of copying and tracing, they were running into this chaos. So at one point in time, the dancers agreed, let's face each other and we'll pretend we're shaking hands but pass each other. And by doing this, they got their first chance of being able to translate. Then there was another one that said, well, just drop it like a fishing line. So suddenly these ideas of a sort of metaphor, but not metaphor but metaphor as a translating machine started to come in. And in a way, I want to sort of open up this discussion with Shane and Laura about teaching and instructing in the rehearsal. In the bump, it says Shane Waltener has collaborated with dance artist Laura Glasner to interpret stitching patterns into a set of movements. Doesn't that sound easy? So I just want to sort of open up and talk a little bit about the rehearsal process and what happened with that exchange and the roles that you played with each other in doing this, why we had to have a dancer mediate in between, perhaps.
Yeah, okay, so I'll start.
Yeah.
That's a good start. I'll just hold it. So the starting point came, actually it's a little bit, it's kind of difficult to trace. I've done a lot of participatory work where rather than produce something and assume the role of the artist, telling you a story, I've done a good number of projects over the last 10 years now where I'm a facilitator of a process where people exchange and create their own narratives. And so the free-form making takes place in a particular situation, in a gallery context, an outdoor situation, usually responding to sight or sort of a particular history, and within the context of usually an exhibition. And I've done this in many different places, using a range of different materials. As I've said earlier, needlecraft, stitching, and weaving are generally the focus. But I've really removed myself from the situation of witnessing what happens. So people have conversations and talk about what needs to be done. Initial amount of work is done as a resource to be used, and people will pick up clues from this to inform what they want to make. And this happens with me being there or even without me being there. And at one point, a couple of years ago, I was asked to do a piece for the Taking Time Craft and the Slow Revolution exhibition. And I thought it would be good to somehow formalize this making and find a way of controlling it in some way and using that making, which relied on some kind of choreography, to kickstart a process of making. But it was quite structured and formalized. And so this was a couple of years ago, and I since then did it in a couple of other places, and then I was invited by Sue to come and work with the stairwell. And the idea was to use the stairwell as a loom to weave around and have the dancers act as human bobbins carrying thread. I came for an initial period of 3-4 visits with an assistant, and we sort of worked up and down stairs, holding yarn. I was looking at this stage at dance patterns, dance notation, sort of pictorial dance notation, looking at social dancing, and looking at stitching patterns as well, and was quite intrigued how there was a relationship or a correspondence between the two types of visual data. So I started with that, and the rest really happened on site with this person I was working with. But the idea right from the start was to have to work with a choreographer who could organize the movements, organize the making into a performance, which you saw today. So that was how the piece came about. Laura stepped in, and we proceeded to work with a number of dancers to develop the piece, always thinking that the work that would be done would be a conversation between the space itself, what could be done around, what could be woven around the banisters, the materials used, and then your way of moving through the staircase. So a combination of these three things.
So how was that for you when you had to come in and...
Yeah, so in the
mediate
beginning, it was meant to be, is this Wednesday evening class from 8 to 9, this is 1 hour class. And we soon realized that this is not enough time because I think we have underestimated that the work with the material is challenging. And maybe also because we are not so used anymore to work with weaving and stitching, and it just really took time to get used to work with the material. So we extended the rehearsal period, which also meant the people changed because not everybody could commit to those extra times. So there was a little bit of inconsistency in terms of not having the same group working in every single rehearsal. But nevertheless, we were working, and maybe that's in the beginning when you came in, when there was a bit of chaos, and we were figuring out how to work with the material and with movement. And I soon realized that Shane is very particular, and it's very precise and specific, and in that there is a pattern that you need to learn, or a stitch consists of a cross and a turn. And this is a terminology that sometimes we also have in dance. There's a vocabulary in some dance techniques or dance forms. So it's not, it's kind of familiar, but still it was a different area. And we had, for example, the turn is a cross, but it's not the cross. The cross is when you pass it on to the other person. And we had a bit of problems with that, and myself as well. And it's only yesterday, for example, that it came to me that a turn could also be, I was thinking turn, I turn myself, I turn to the left, turn to the right. It's always in reference to myself. But if I have an object in me, that doesn't feel like turning. And then I was thinking, but turning the page. Turning the page over. And that is actually the action of the turn. But unfortunately, it only came to me yesterday. so in that sense, there is a translation. I think if you often work with movement in relation to yourself or not with an object, or it is a process to understand what does that new vocabulary mean.
And the terms Laura refers to are the 2 steps for making a stitch in bobbin lace, and that's what we used. And when I refer to the patterns, there is an equivalent maybe between the social dance, the weave, and sort of bobbin lace pattern. But I soon realized, working on this project, that it kind of stops there in a social space when you're working with the material in space with people. The language used, the terminology becomes really ineffective. The turn and cross is whatever we used, and as you know already now that I'm not great with my left and right, but using clockwise and anti-clockwise was not useful either, because if you're facing each other, then you sort of reverse this. And so there were all these things to think of and consider. The one thing that happened is, having given you a bit of background about the participatory work, how I set these projects up is that people very much do their own thing. I'm interested in creating a space where people can invent or develop their own relationship with material. As soon as you're told how to hold a brush and mix your paints, then you can't unlearn that. And so it's free-form making. And for me, making the switch here was quite a tricky one. I had illusions of allowing the dancers to really find their own, invent their own stitches, and make and unpicking the stitching and finding new ways of doing things. I was considering all these possibilities. What happened was that we had to spend a long time just learning the basics, and it brought home to me that, of course, the things that appear really simple, the simple manipulations, whatever they are, of whatever nature, require sort of a lot of tacit knowledge and require a lot of experience, and it becomes invisible, and makers are sometimes not as find it maybe quite difficult to sort of articulate what it is they're doing and how they're doing it, and that making those processes are invisible. And for myself, maybe I have taken this for granted in some way, but it all came out in the open as we were doing this, and many extra sessions needed to be planned to just find out how the bobbins behave once you wound them with the jute. They would twist. Now, if you wind the bobbin like this, or you roll the bobbins, it makes a great difference as to how it hangs and how it behaves. You know which direction to twist, depending on whether your jute is an S bend or an S twist, or a Z twist. Now, an S twist is this for me, but for you, of course, this is a Z twist. And so all these details were really quite intriguing and challenging,
and a breakdown of language, which is really interesting, the breakdown of language. I think that's something that was really sort of, and what happens at that crisis of language when it does break down. I'm very interested in this idea of the limits of language, or the limits of, that we can say something, that there's a language of dance, or that there's a language of design, or that there's a language of art. And that within this, it's not that art objects speak to each other as we do here. This is that within that there are languages, but that we name things to each other as humans. And somewhere in this area, we hit up against the edge of language. And I think this is one of the things that really struck me tonight was, one, how quiet it was. It was really quiet. Did you find that? Yeah. It was very, very, very quiet. I felt like I was on a creaking ship, watching the hands come in and out and pulling in the sails, or putting out the sails. And there was something, and I think, well, where are we sailing to? Where we're setting sail out beyond language, if there is something about it that we can move beyond that. But one of the things that we sort of confronted with is having to sort of summarize this into a textual sort of way, that we might have to write something about this, and how much that slips in doing something like that. And I'm wondering, if you were going to write instructions for this evening, what form would those instructions take now that you've had that experience of making this together through translation?
We're just discussing this today, actually, because so far what we have is, of course, the piece exists in our memory, and we've seen it, and you've all seen it. I noticed that between one rehearsal and the other, a lot of information was lost. Things weren't remembered. We've relied on film to document some of the moments in the piece, but it's not a chronological sort of film from start to finish of the action itself. I've been making notes, and Laura's been making notes, and but the it's got to be thought about. I'm not quite sure we've decided as to sort of what form this script will take. I'm interested in, of course, what is left in the stairwell to be. It's a trace of the movement. It's an indication of where the dancers have moved to and from. It is a notation in itself, but it doesn't. Equipped with seeing that, I think it would be pretty difficult to recreate the piece. Something happened. Mentioning the film, the person who did the footage or filmed the dancers stitching was quite perplexed at. The process of filming was asking the dancers to stop and start, to redo certain things, and that interrupted the flow, and I get a sense that a lot of the movements were remembered through repetition and through building up a certain rhythm. So stopping and starting, the dance became invisible, and he couldn't really see it, but he saw, after we were talking on the phone while he was editing the footage, and he saw the flow. by cutting and pasting and piecing things together, piecing film. Now he's a filmmaker, so he saw the dance through the piece, through the filming. My understanding of the piece comes through the making and looking at the material and looking at the knots. And that gives me an indication of where there was a turn and where there was a cross and how many people were working. And the dancers have had to remember this in a very different way through memorizing where they are and stepping and their movement across the staircase.
Can I just pick up the sort of the repetition and the memory thing? I mean, there are points in where the hands sort of come in and go out and come in and go out, and you're watching this repetition, and I found it very hypnotizing. And that sort of process of hypnosis, that where memory can really lock on. Do dancers work at all with that kind of repetition of sort of working in a slightly a level that doesn't have to work on the level of spoken linguistic language, but rather on a level that is coded by repetition, by closing the eyes and remembering with the eyes shut? Is that a sort of dancer's technique, or how do dancers remember these things?
There are a few other dancers in here, I see.
I'm sure there are. How do dancers remember these? But for visual artists, it's often in sort of right in front of you. But how do dancers remember these moves?
I think when we were given instructions at first, they were really helpful, just to understand the stitching. But then to actually learn it, it was quite helpful for them having no instructions at all, and actually just feeling the weight of the bobbins, the pulling, and kind of incorporating our movement and our weight in with that, and it made a lot of sense. I mean, for me, terminology was a bit difficult at first, because a turn for me was me putting my left hand over and my right under, so I was thinking over and across instead of. But yeah, once I got the understanding of the movement of the yarn and the fact that my body weight had to pull the yarn, then there was a lot of it began to flow.
I think you mentioned also the weight, and so I think dancers work a lot as well with sensation, to feel, or also where am I in space in relation to the object here, or in relation to up and down, and of course that is not a language place, and the body has a memory of itself, which is not necessarily linked to language.
Though it's an object place. It's an object place in terms of its weight and shape and shift and that kind of thing. That's sort of, I'm thinking about YouTube videos, and I'm thinking about IKEA instructions. The way in which instructions can confuse. I don't know whether anybody's encountered that, where instructions might be more confusing than they are informing. But we now live in an age where we can learn so much off of the internet. And the question of what kind of knowledge are we able to share with one another, and how can we transfer this knowledge to one another, is an urgent sort of question that keeps arising. And I'm very interested in this document here. When I see the document and see this as which he's sort of turned into not just an instructional video, but it has an interpretive sense to it. And I'm wondering if there isn't something about allowing the instruction to become an artwork might not be an interesting mechanism to overcome some of these things, like what you did. If you've seen down in the bar area, there are some of the stitches that are done over the floor plans of the architecture here, which also show dance steps. And there's something about that seems to sort of hold a tremendous amount of information without that having a literal translation. And I'm wondering if the artwork can operate in that way.
it's the pictures downstairs are quite, I thought would be the pattern that would set the piece in motion. As it is, they've happened, they were woven afterwards. They were woven once the piece was created and informed the stitching itself. On the picture was a result of the knowledge gained while working with the dancers and knowing what was possible and what wasn't possible. And they're sort of, in a way, they objectify what you see here. With this piece, I think I was very interested in moving beyond the object, and so it's not really about what you see, but it's about the doing. And the piece has now been put up and taken down at least a dozen times, I think. But the odd thing is that with that, there's still, it remained how to do it, and every time we do it, it's different. And I dare say, in parts, I mean, Laura said I'm quite fussy, but in parts it's nothing like what the piece was like last time. And so there's that, I'm quite interested in that sort of human element, I guess, and the chance element, and with certain certain coincidences or sort of a particular timing or sort of a misstep, then sort of things change and within a sort of format. So I'm not sure whether that answers your question, but both with the piece and with the film and with the pictures of the weaving on the architectural drawing, I think there's an effort to try and fix things, but they remain quite fluid. There's certain parameters. Each step meant a couple of pins, and then I started with a number of threads that sort of matched the number of threads we used here, and I proceed with my turning and twisting and crossing, and then you set something in motion, but there's still a chance element within this very specific process, very particular way of maneuvering things over actual space or virtual space in the picture.
I'm suddenly having images of interpreting IKEA instructions, interpretive IKEA, interpretive furniture. But I think this is one we can sort of open up the floor to people's experiences of what instructions are. If you've ever been to a dance class and been told to go left, and you go right, and you're the only one that goes right, I'm sure that I've certainly experienced that. That maybe left and right aren't really appropriate. But I'd really like to open up the floor to anybody's sort of comments about the work that they saw today, or anything, any questions.
Yes.
First of all, it's wonderful to see something made, because so often you see something and you think, oh, I wonder how they made that, and so we see this thing being made. I was interested that you were talking about the language, and then started talking about this extraordinary technical, problems of instructions and things. But the language I was thinking of from the outside was much more, weaving. It occurred to me that we weave three things. We weave stories, which you wear. 3 stories, aren't they? 1, 2, 3. Webs, or traps, maybe, and spells, which perhaps accounts for the silence and the spell that you're weaving. I'm just wondering if those 3 things actually connect to the work the work that the artists have done before.
Interesting. You mentioned the spell, and there was an incredible silence during the performance, which made me slightly edgy. And some of you were at the last performance, and the last performance was, by comparison, really loud, and people sort of moved up and down the stairs. And I'm kind of perplexed as to why there was such a change between this time and sort of on the previous occasion. But yes, the weaving of narratives and stories. In the piece, I guess the broader context for the piece in the stairwell is the piece on the first floor, which is the outcome of a participatory project where people stitched deconstructed clothing and stitched it together again, and it's exhibited. I keep the material, I keep the work that is produced as a document of the activity, of the interaction between the makers, but it's something that is more of a symbolic object than anything. I mean, it won't literally say what was told, what was exchanged, but there is somehow still a grammar with the stitch, with the material used, all the things you've twisted yourself with the same instructions, confused as they might be with your piece of string, have ended up looking very different. And that prompted me to exhibit the piece as text. So there is this notion of text as language, text as stories. However, with that's with the piece on the first floor. With this piece here, I think it's more of a direct response to the stuff you see, the elements that are there. That wasn't me, was it?
Yeah.
That's good. Okay.
There was a moment, it was like narrative when I was on the first floor and they were doing something quite intricate, and then suddenly it kind of went off in another direction, which is what stories do, suddenly, what they have a life of their own.
Yeah.
And you do get the stories,
You do. Both types of stories, yes, you do, yes.
This is very well thought out, but I've always been interested in the link between text and text style. And it was interesting listening to you talk about instructions in terms of spoken instructions and then written instructions. And I was just kind of thinking about the relationship of body to speech, if that makes sense. So that and you sat on your hands, so you didn't show us how
Yes.
to do that. And I just wondered if you had any, and there's something about permanence and temporary in all of that as well. I just
Yes.
wondered if you had any reflections about, I suppose, your text and the spoken language and where the body kind of sits.
Yeah. This is to me? Yes. Anyone? All right. Well, I read a text recently that by Tim Ingold, who talks about text and the origin of the word and textere, which he's weaving, and talks very eloquently about lines as well, and the word line coming from linium, which is a length of thread, a length of flax. So the connection between text and narrative, I think, is an interesting one, and one might think of the piece of fabric as holding a story, and there's a lot of myths as well that are associated with that, and stitching as well. But I have to say, I think it's interesting to have all these stories come together and facilitate them, and for there to be an exchange. But for me, ultimately, what you're left with is the material, and I think that is what I'm really interested in. And it can sort of you try and tell a story through the fabric, through the piece that's on the first floor. People might recognize or have associations with the shirts, the pattern, the cloth that is there, that's both in the object itself, but also it's very much to do with their own personal stories.
I mean, I just a couple of things. One, about the stories. I'm thinking, is it Joan Didion that says, we tell stories to save our lives? And I think there's something about the story and history and how we try to remember. I think this thing of speaking and remembering, that the beginning of writing was a sort of crises, and it was sort of advised against it because we would start to forget. And so there's how we remember and how we forget through these things of stories, but through this thing of the material, as the voice as a material potentially, as the story as the thread, the story thread. I think there's I think we come very close to not only the structure of language, but the way that we ourselves are structured within that as humans. And I think that this is what's sort of quite extraordinary about this piece, is that it is a real triggering when you look at this. It's not necessarily about seeing a self-contained piece, but rather the way that it prompts reflection on things like web, and then the World Wide Web, and stories, and history, and spells, and the double meaning of a spell, to spell a word or to cast a spell. And I think this is something that we come close to in this kind of work, which is really, really fascinating. That the translation was something that I wanted to sort of tease out in a way, what the choreographer was doing, how she had to work with the translation, and that this was again, a sort of translating machine, if you like, you know.
I think one thing that comes to my mind as well is rhythm. Today it was silent, and I could really hear what I was doing, even more so than the last time. And there is a certain rhythm to it, and that's also a way of memorizing something. And it was quite clear for me today. Also the thread, as it came across the barister, it made noise. And the last time we were performing, I couldn't hear anything because people were chatting. And yeah, I think rhythm and sound is also part of all this memory. And phrasing, you know, to text and language, and rhythms and changing of tempo and all that.
Go ahead.
Interesting, you were talking about tempo and phrasing, and so that makes me think of dynamics, and this movement from dynamics to space. And whilst I was watching the demonstration stroke performance, I was starting to think about geometric forms that Darwin, for instance, would use when he was trying to make sense of space constances. So I wonder if you had any of that in your mind whilst you were working with this weaving. And I think it would be really interesting to hear from a textile point of view as well, as to how you thought about space as three-dimensional.
Laura, do you want to?
Yeah, space, yes, of course. We were working in a confined space, and we were working around the banisters. But we had to move in space in order to make the stitching happening. So it wasn't just in front of us. And also, I think it's a combination of doing the stitch and walking. So you are in space, and the hands go into another space. You know, the barristers were here, so I felt there was the space, the square, that was empty throughout all the three levels, and we were reaching into that space with our hands to create something as we were walking on a different space, which was the staircase. So, yes, and also the web, of course, creates space, and you look at the space differently as afterwards.
It's a transformation. It's about finding out almost like an essential shape for the staircase, because you have this rectangle, the well is rectangular, and as the stitching takes place, it becomes a spiral. And if our arms were really long and could extend beyond, right up to the center, then that spiral would become a line, a straight line. And I was quite interested in that. And that's something that's really dictated by the architecture. And I'm quite interested in revealing that, and I hope the piece does that in some ways. The top story and the bottom story, there's a crisscrossing that also describes the movement of the dancers from when they picked up the bobbin to where they hook it on the banister. And it describes that movement in a different way. It's a slightly different shape, but that was quite interesting. And as they did it, some things were moved from the top to the bottom and back again. I'm sorry, that's the reverse, from the bottom to top and back again, created this, in fact, that if you think of it as a line, it becomes a Mobius strip. So there's this image of a loop of infinity. because you have a twist and then you have the straight line, the dropping of the bobbins. And I was quite interested in that. It mirrors somehow the activity in the staircase with people going up and down constantly as we were rehearsing. And of course, stairs are used to sort of go from one floor to the other. So there's this constant flux, and that image is not something I planned, but something that was revealed really through the doing, and that for me is quite exciting.
Did you?
I was coming in from looking at knowing your work as a sculptor and seeing this as really seeing a sculpture develop in front of your eyes, and I found that kind of amazing. Whether the dancing element of it is, I mean, it's very much your work, though, Shane. Do you know what I'm saying? It's not. It doesn't get transformed as much by the dancing in a funny way, and somehow, you were saying it's a bit of a tyrant about making stitching. Is that he has this vision that you're trying to realise?
Yeah. Yes, it was a pattern. It's not so much that, as we said, because we used a lot of time getting used to work with the material, we were actually, the pattern was clear. So maybe my work was more to make it happen and to do this translation of how can you embody it, or how can you, not get lost in only the stitching, but how do you use maybe the whole yourself and how you move around, or in relation to the others.
It's a privilege seeing work develop in front of you, and I think that's why people were so respectful tonight. You're actually seeing an artwork to be created in front of you, and that's partly through the talents, whoever's doing it, but it's also about that active making, which you don't often see. So maybe that's why it's so silent.
Raises interesting questions about the authorship as well, I think. It really brings that home. Who is making this work and whose name is on that work? Who owns this work? Well, maybe you can sort of, I'm going to bring this to a close. Sorry. Sorry to cut off any further questions, but thank you for coming. Thank you to Laura and Shane, and to the dancers this evening, and to Siobhan Davies in the Siobhan Davies studio. Thank you to all of you for attending.